There is a prophecy so severe in the book of Zechariah that many readers get to it and slow down, not because his words are difficult to understand, but because they are too light. Centuries before modern wars, weapons capable of destroying cities, and technologies that would transform human fear, a prophet described God's judgment with disturbing physical accuracy. Bodies still standing, eyes consumed, tongues torn apart inside mouths. But this vision was not born in a palace, nor was it given to a people living in prosperous times. She emerged from among the ruins. Around 520 BC, Jerusalem still bore the scars of the Babylonian invasion. Its walls were destroyed. The temple, which for generations had symbolized the presence of God, had been reduced to rubble. Many houses remained empty, and the streets that once welcomed pilgrims now served as a reminder of all that Israel had lost. The exile was over, but the crisis was not. The survivors had returned to the land of their ancestors, but rebuilding a city was easier than rebuilding hope. They faced opposition, scarcity, and discouragement. Some began to rebuild their own homes, while the temple remained unfinished. Others probably wondered if the ancient promises still held true. It was in this environment that Zechariah began to prophesy. He didn't just appear to talk about stones, altars, and buildings. His message would transcend centuries. God showed him that the history of Jerusalem was far from over. In a single night, Zechariah received a series of 8 visions. He saw horsemen riding across the land, horns representing the powers that had scattered Judah, a man holding a measuring line, as if Jerusalem were about to be rebuilt beyond its former boundaries. He saw the high priest Joshua before the accuser, dressed in unclean garments, until his guilt was removed. Each vision carried an immediate message for those people, but some of them pointed to a much more distant horizon. Zechariah began speaking of a king who would arrive in Jerusalem humbly, riding on a donkey. Centuries later, Jesus would enter that same city in that same manner. The prophet also spoke of someone who would be pierced, and of a people who in the future would weep upon recognizing him. However, his prophecy did not end with the first coming of the Messiah. She was advancing towards a day of extreme conflict, when Jerusalem would be surrounded, the nations would rise up against her, and all human hope would seem to vanish. Zechariah called this moment the Day of the Lord. In the prophets, this expression doesn't simply describe an ordinary day on the calendar. It points to God's decisive intervention in history, a moment of justice, confrontation, and revelation. The instant when human arrogance finds a limit it cannot surpass. Chapter 14 begins without softening the blow. Jerusalem would be attacked. The city would suffer. Houses would be looted. Part of the population would be taken away. There is no attempt to hide the pain of that moment. But when defeat seemed inevitable, something would change. The Lord himself would go out to fight. Then, according to Zechariah, his feet would be on the Mount of Olives, located east of Jerusalem. The mountain would split in two, forming a large valley. Half would move north and the other half south. The same region that, many centuries later, would be associated with the ascension of Jesus appears in the prophecy as the setting for a future intervention by God. The earth would open up. A route would emerge where a barrier once existed, and those who were surrounded would find a way to escape. But that opening in the mountain wouldn't be the most frightening event of that day. While the survivors escaped, the armies gathered against Jerusalem would face something that no military strategy could stop. It would not simply be a defeat on the battlefield. Zechariah described a plague sent against those who had advanced to destroy the city. For centuries, interpreters have debated whether his words should be understood literally, symbolically, or as a prophetic image of utter devastation. The text, however, does not avoid the details. He intensifies them. The meat would be consumed while the people were still standing on their own feet. Eyes would disintegrate in their sockets. The tongue would be eaten inside the mouth. We don't know exactly what mechanism will bring about this judgment. The Bible doesn't mention bombs, radiation, or any human technology. It attributes the action to the Lord himself. And perhaps that's precisely what makes the passage so unsettling. Zechariah wasn't trying to satisfy curiosity about future weapons. He was showing how far human rebellion can lead, and what happens when nations believe they can besiege Jerusalem without ever answering to the God of Israel. But there is an even deeper question. Why, in the midst of a message of restoration, hope, and messianic promise, did God allow Zechariah to witness such a harsh scene? The answer doesn't lie solely in the judgment. She is focused on what will happen immediately after him, because the same chapter that describes bodies being consumed ends by announcing a king over all the earth. And to understand how terror and hope can occupy the same prophecy, we need to go back to the moment when Jerusalem is besieged and discover who will be recognized when there is no human way out left. Jerusalem was not just a walled city. For the people of Israel, it carried memory, promise, and presence. There stood Mount Zion. There the temple had been. There kings had ruled, prophets had warned, and entire generations had ascended to worship. Therefore, when Zechariah describes the nations gathered against Jerusalem, he is not merely referring to a territorial dispute. What's at stake is the symbolic core of the alliance. In the prophet's time, however, this great city seemed too fragile to play any decisive role in the future. Its inhabitants were still rebuilding what the Babylonians had destroyed. The walls did not offer complete security. The economy was limited. The people lived surrounded by adversaries and carried the recent memory of exile. From a human perspective, Jerusalem seemed small. Prophetically, she remained at the center of history. Zechariah foresaw a time when the city would not only be attacked by a regional empire, as had happened in the past. He spoke of a much larger concentration of peoples gathered for battle, and a crisis that would surpass human capacity for defense. The prophet's language is intense. The city would be taken. Violence would reach homes. Some of the inhabitants would be taken away. The feeling would be one of complete abandonment. But there is something important in this sequence. God does not intervene before the crisis begins. He intervenes when human self-sufficiency comes to an end. This pattern appears repeatedly in Scripture. At the Red Sea, Israel only saw the way open when the Egyptian army was already approaching. In the days of Gideon, victory came when the Israelite army had been reduced to a number that made it impossible to attribute the result to military strength. In Jerusalem, during the Assyrian siege, the threat reached the gates before the divine response manifested itself. Zacharias takes this pattern to the extreme. In the scenario he describes, no alliance will be able to save the city. No diplomatic strategy will be sufficient. No wall, technology, or military command will be able to bring about ultimate liberation. Then, the Lord will go out to fight. This statement changes the entire atmosphere of the prophecy. The God who seemed silent enters the field of history. The Mount of Olives occupies a central place in this scene. Located east of Jerusalem, it rises before the city, separated from it by the Kidron Valley. Throughout the biblical narrative, this mountain has been linked to moments of sorrow, prayer, and expectation. It was through this region that David passed, weeping as he fled Absalom's rebellion. Many centuries later, Jesus would weep as he contemplated Jerusalem. There he would speak of the destruction of the temple and of future events. And according to the book of Acts, it was from this area that he ascended, while his disciples received the promise that he would return. Zechariah had written long before these events. Nevertheless, his vision placed the hill at the center of a future intervention. The text states that the Lord's feet would be upon it, and that the mountain would split from east to west, forming a large valley. This image is magnificent, but its meaning is also profoundly human. The obstacle becomes a passage. The elevated place opens up. When survivors find no way out, the landscape itself is altered, so they can escape. Some interpreters understand this passage literally. Others see in it prophetic language, representing the supernatural removal of all barriers. The text, however, presents the event as a concrete and decisive intervention by God. But splitting the mountain does not end the crisis. As an escape route emerges, chaos spreads among the enemy armies. Zechariah describes confusion. Men turn against each other. The military organization crumbles. What seemed an invincible force begins to destroy itself from within. It wouldn't be the first time that a coalition against God's people ended in chaos. In the days of Jehoshaphat, allied armies advanced against Judah, but ended up fighting amongst themselves. In other biblical narratives, panic transformed superior forces into mobs incapable of distinguishing friend from foe. In Zechariah, this collapse reaches an even greater scale. The coalition assembled against Jerusalem faces not only human resistance, it encounters divine judgment. This is where many readers connect Zechariah to other prophecies. Ezekiel also described a great force advancing against Israel. In his chapters about Gog, allied peoples, weapons, ambition, and an invasion that ends with God's intervention appear. But caution is needed. The exact relationship between Ezekiel 38 and 39 and Zechariah 14 is debated. Some scholars believe the texts point to the same final conflict. Others consider that they describe distinct events within a broader prophetic context. The Bible does not present a table that resolves all these questions. She offers perspectives that converge on one point. No human power will have the final say. Empires rise. Alliances are formed. Leaders make plans. Armies cross borders. But there is an invisible limit to the arrogance of nations. And Zechariah shows the moment when that limit will be surpassed. Still, the greatest tension in the prophecy doesn't lie solely with the armies surrounding the city. It's in the people within it. For centuries, Israel had waited for the Messiah. Zechariah had announced a humble king. He had also spoken of someone who would be pierced. Later, he described a spirit of grace and supplication poured out on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Then, one of the most moving images of the entire prophecy emerges. They would look on the one they had pierced, and they would cry. It wouldn't be the weeping over a simple military defeat. It would be lament, recognition, and heartbreak, the kind of pain that arises when a truth, long rejected, finally becomes impossible to deny. The text does not present this moment as a result of political persuasion or religious debate. It happens in the midst of a crisis, when Jerusalem is destitute, when the danger reaches its peak, and when the Lord intervenes. The people will recognize the one they did not recognize before. But this revelation will not come alone. The recognition of the Messiah and the judgment of the nations are part of the same turning point. On one side, there will be supplication. On the other hand, terror. On one side, a crowd looking at the one who was pierced. On the other hand, armies are discovering that the battle they imagined they were waging against a city was, in fact, against God himself. And it is precisely at this moment that Zechariah describes the plague that made his chapter one of the most unsettling texts in all of prophetic literature. Because what will happen to those men will not be an ordinary defeat. It will be something that begins while they are still standing. Zechariah 14:12 does not allow for a hasty reading. After announcing that the Lord will fight against the nations gathered against Jerusalem, the prophet describes the consequence of this confrontation in terms that have endured through the centuries without losing their power. The flesh will be devoured while the men are still standing. Their eyes will bulge out in their sockets. Their tongues will be consumed inside their mouths. The scene is so specific that it provokes an inevitable question. Was Zechariah symbolically describing the complete destruction of an army, or did he actually see a physical judgment that would strike the human body suddenly? Throughout history, different interpreters have offered distinct answers. Some understand that the prophet used extreme language, common in texts of judgment, to represent defeat, humiliation, and total disappearance. In this reading, the bodily details reinforce the impossibility of resisting the Lord. Others believe the passage points to a literal event. The anatomical accuracy would not merely be a figure of speech, but a description of a real plague, even though Zechariah lacked the technical vocabulary to explain its nature. There is also an interpretation that combines both perspectives. The judgment would be literal in its effects, but it would carry an even greater spiritual meaning. That which human beings consider their strength can vanish in an instant before the sovereignty of God. The text does not identify a weapon. It makes no mention of fire launched by men, explosions, radiation, or any future technology. Therefore, to assert with certainty that Zechariah described a nuclear attack would go beyond what is written. It is true that, after the 20th century, many readers began to compare the prophecy to the effects of weapons of mass destruction. The association arose because humanity finally witnessed forms of devastation capable of affecting the body in a rapid and terrifying way. But comparison is not proven compliance. Zechariah attributes the plague to the Lord. This detail changes everything. The central theme of the passage is not humanity's technological advancement. It is God's intervention against those who rose up to destroy Jerusalem. Whatever means are used, the biblical narrative insists that the outcome will not come from chance, nor merely from the military superiority of one side over the other. Judgment will be inevitable, and it will happen too fast for anyone to react. Men will still be in combat positions when their bodies begin to fail. Trained soldiers, protected by weapons, and organized in ranks, will discover that no human preparation offers security against that moment. But physical destruction will not be the only terror. The following verse describes a great confusion sent by the Lord. Each man will grab his companion's hand and turn against the one who was beside him. The collective force will dissolve. Discipline will disappear. The army that advanced as a unit will transform into groups dominated by panic. This combination of plague and confusion appears elsewhere in Scripture. In several episodes, God did not need to provide Israel with a larger army. It was enough to remove from the adversaries the ability to act in a coordinated manner. Fear did the rest. In Zechariah, however, the scene takes on ultimate proportions. It is not an isolated battle within the history of Israel, but a confrontation associated with the day of the Lord. And the day of the Lord carries an uncomfortable truth. There will come a time when divine patience will no longer mean postponement. For generations, nations wage wars, build empires, and shed blood believing that God remains distant. Silence is interpreted as absence. Mercy is mistaken for indifference. But the prophets present a different reality. God's apparent silence is not a lack of control. Time has been granted, a time for repentance, a time for change, a time for injustice to reveal its true nature. When that period ends, divine intervention does not happen hesitantly. It comes as a decision. That is why Zechariah 14:12 should not be used merely to fuel fear or curiosity about the end times. The verse exposes an ancient illusion, the belief that humankind can indefinitely defy God's justice without facing consequences. Those armies will not only be attacking one city, they will be repeating a pattern that runs throughout the entire Bible. Pharaoh believed he could imprison God's people forever. The Assyrian Empire imagined Jerusalem would be just another conquered city. Nebuchadnezzar gazed upon Babylon and claimed all the glory for himself. In each case, human power seemed absolute until it ceases to be. In Zechariah's narrative, this arrogance reaches its peak. The nations do not gather to negotiate, but to dominate. Jerusalem becomes the visible target of a much deeper rebellion. Behind the political conflict, there is a spiritual confrontation. Still, caution is needed when trying to identify every modern nation, every military alliance, or every contemporary crisis as a direct fulfillment of prophecy. Throughout the centuries, many generations have believed they were facing the final conflict. Some saw specific empires as the final characters in history. Others set dates that came and went. Biblical vigilance does not require haste. It demands sobriety. Jesus taught his disciples to recognize signs, but he also warned them against deception. Wars and rumors of wars would be part of the scenario, but they should not produce immediate panic. The goal was not to turn every piece of news into definitive proof, but to keep hearts alert. Zechariah does not provide a detailed calendar. It offers a certainty. The Lord will reign. This certainty is more important than any attempt to decipher in advance all the movements of history. But then another connection emerges. Centuries after Zechariah, the Apostle John would also describe the return of Christ, the gathering of the nations, and the judgment of those who oppose God's rule. His images, recorded in Revelation, would echo the same scenario of conflict, terror, and sovereignty. Long before John, an ancient work attributed to Enoch already spoke of judgment, rebellious spirit beings, and the fate of the wicked. The Book of Enoch does not hold the same authority for most Christian traditions as the books of the Old and New Testaments. Even so, it helps to understand how ancient Jewish communities envisioned the spiritual world, judgment, and the end of evil. The similarity between some of its themes and biblical prophecies sparks curiosity, but it also requires discernment, because there is a difference between finding parallels and declaring that two texts are describing exactly the same event. And it is in this difference that many sensationalist interpretations begin to stray from what can actually be demonstrated. To understand what Zechariah, John, and the tradition associated with Enoch have in common, it will be necessary to delve into a more complex area of prophecy, a region where angels, nations, judgment, and hope meet, and where one question becomes impossible to avoid: what clearly belongs to biblical revelation, and what has arisen from human attempts to fill its silences. Before comparing Zechariah, Revelation, and the Book of Enoch, it is necessary to establish an essential difference. Zechariah belongs to the group of prophets in the Old Testament. Revelation is part of the New Testament. Both are part of the Christian canon and are received by the Church as Scripture. The Book of Enoch occupies a different position. This is an ancient Jewish work associated with the name of Enoch, a character mentioned in Genesis. Its content influenced the religious environment of some Jewish groups close to the New Testament period, and one of its passages is quoted in the Epistle of Jude. This, however, does not mean that all Christian traditions consider it inspired or canonical. In most Christian circles, it is read as important ancient literature for understanding certain ideas about angels, judgment, and spiritual corruption, but not as an authority equivalent to the biblical books. This distinction does not weaken the investigation. It makes her more honest. When Zechariah speaks of the day of the Lord, he describes God's intervention in history, the judgment of the nations, and the establishment of his kingdom. When John records his visions in Revelation, similar themes reappear: kings gathered together, spiritual powers, final conflict, and the victorious manifestation of Christ. Enoch also speaks about spiritual rebellion and judgment, but not in the same way. In his narrative, the corruption of the world does not begin solely with human decisions. It is linked to the so-called Watchers, celestial beings who abandoned their position, crossed boundaries established by God, and contributed to the violence that engulfed the earth before the flood. The text of Genesis 6 mentions the sons of God, the daughters of men, and the Nephilim. However, it does not offer all the details found in the Book of Enoch. It was precisely in this silence that ancient traditions grew. The Book of Enoch presents names, hierarchies, transgressions, and punishments that do not appear to the same extent in the Bible. According to this work, the Watchers taught human beings destructive practices, increasing corruption and transforming knowledge into an instrument of violence. This image exerted a profound influence on the ancient Jewish imagination. The visible world would not be the only battlefield. Behind kings, wars, and empires, spiritual forces are also said to be at work. The Bible confirms the existence of this spiritual dimension. Daniel describes conflicts involving the Prince of Persia and the Prince of Greece. Paul states that the struggle is not only against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. Revelation portrays the dragon handing authority over to the beast. But there is a difference between recognizing a spiritual reality and attributing every political event to a specific being without clear foundation. It is at this point that curiosity can surpass revelation. When Zechariah declares that all nations will be gathered against Jerusalem, The text does not explain in detail how each ruler will be persuaded, what treaties will be signed, or what spiritual powers will act upon each leader. What it reveals is the result. Humanity will reach a point of concentrated opposition against God's purposes. John describes something similar. In Revelation, deceiving spirits go forth to gather the kings of the earth for battle. The language shows that the final conflict will have a political, military, and spiritual dimension. The rulers will make real decisions. Nations will mobilize real forces. But behind these choices lies a deeper deception. This does not remove human responsibility. On the contrary, it makes the scene even more serious. Spiritual evil doesn't transform people into mindless machines. It seduces, intensifies desires, and offers justifications for ambitions that have already found a place in the heart. Pride, domination, fear, desire for control. The same impulse that moved ancient empires reappears in new forms throughout history. Therefore, biblical prophecy should not be reduced to a list of modern countries. Its scope is broader. It reveals the spiritual pattern that leads entire nations to imagine that they can build a world without submission to the Creator. Zechariah sees this pattern reaching its limit. Joel sees the same spirit of rebellion organized on a global scale. Enoch, drawing from an ancient Jewish tradition, describes human corruption being fueled by powers that have broken their boundaries. The three scenarios are not identical, but they converge on one truth. Evil is never just what appears on the surface. A war can begin over territory, resources, or security. However, behind the propaganda and strategic decisions, there can also be idolatry of power, contempt for life, and the age-old temptation to take the place of God. That is why Revelation does not present the final battle merely as a contest between armies. He presents it as a confrontation between two governments. On one side, the kingdom of God, represented by the Lamb. On the other hand, there is a system built on deception, coercion, and the worship of power. John sees the beast, the false prophet, and the dragon. They are not merely frightening characters to fuel religious imagination. They represent an alliance between political authority, spiritual seduction, and deceptive propaganda. Power demands loyalty. Deception provides justification, and violence punishes those who refuse to submit. This mechanism did not originate in the book of Revelation. It already appeared in Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, when an image was erected, and everyone was ordered to worship it. It also appeared in Egypt, when Pharaoh turned people into instruments of production and decided which children could live. The end times, therefore, will not create a completely new evil. It will take ancient standards to their fullest expression. But John also shows the outcome. When the kings of the earth gather to wage war against the one who comes riding the white horse, it is not a balanced battle. Christ does not find an equal adversary. Victory doesn't depend on numbers. The beast is defeated. The false prophet is judged. Systems that seemed invincible crumble before the word of him who is called King of Kings and Lord of Lords. This is where Revelation approaches Zechariah with the greatest intensity. In both texts, the nations come together. In both, Jerusalem and God's rule are at the center of the conflict. In both cases, divine intervention occurs when human opposition appears to have reached its maximum strength. And in both cases, the result is not just destruction, it's a kingdom. Zechariah announces that the Lord will be king over all the earth. John sees the kingdoms of the world becoming the Lord's and his Christ's. The trial is not the final destination of the story. He removes that which hinders true peace. But before the kingdom comes, there will be an exhibition. Every false sense of security will be shattered. Every alliance built against God will reveal its weakness. Every spiritual force that operated in the shadows will be subjected to the authority of Christ. And this leads to a question closer to home. If the prophecy speaks of deceit, vigilance, and loyalty, then its primary application is not to discover in advance the name of every future ruler. It's recognizing whom your heart is already obeying now. Because before men bow down to a visible system, they have almost always already bowed down inwardly to fear, pride, or expediency. And perhaps the most dangerous sign of recent times is not a distant war. Perhaps it is the ability of an entire generation to continue living normally while gradually losing the sensitivity to hear the voice of God. Prophecy can awaken consciousness, but it can also fuel anxiety. This difference depends on how it is received. When Jesus spoke about wars, persecutions, false prophets, and upheavals among nations, he did not intend to create a generation obsessed with dates. His goal was to prepare disciples capable of remaining faithful when the world around them lost its stability. The order was not, calculate every detail. It was, don't be fooled. This warning appears before many others in Matthew 24, before the earthquakes, before the famine, before the wars. Jesus draws attention to the danger of spiritual confusion, because a visible crisis is frightening, but the deception can seem convincing. He rarely arrives announcing his intention to turn someone away from God. He often presents himself as an urgent matter, secret knowledge, or an interpretation that promises to explain everything. He offers quick answers to complex questions and transforms any event into definitive proof that the end will begin immediately. The result is not surveillance. It's unsettling. People wake up searching for news that confirms their fears. They analyze speeches, borders, alliances, and military movements. Each new conflict seems to complete a piece of the puzzle. Every silence seems to hide a conspiracy. Meanwhile, something more important may be being lost: life before God. Jesus did not condemn discerning the times. He criticized those who knew how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but did not recognize what God was doing before them. The problem was never about observing. The problem is observing the whole world and failing to examine one's own heart. Zechariah announced that the nations would be gathered against Jerusalem. Ezekiel described a stunning invasion. Daniel spoke of kingdoms, conflicts, and powers that would arise. John saw political and spiritual systems concentrating authority. These texts deserve attention, but none of them were designed to turn fear into a way of life. Biblical prophecy calls for faithfulness. She reminds us that empires are not eternal. Leaders do not control the outcome of history. Seemingly invincible systems have a limited lifespan. Injustice will not continue forever. This message should inspire courage. However, when removed from its center, it can produce the exact opposite. Instead of trusting in God's sovereignty, the reader begins to fear every human action. Instead of loving their neighbor, they start treating them as a cog in a theory. Instead of proclaiming hope, they communicate only catastrophe, and the name of Christ, which should be at the center, becomes almost a detail among maps, dates, and speculations. That is why Jesus told the parable of the 10 virgins. They were all waiting for the groom to arrive. They all had light bulbs. They all fell asleep while waiting. The difference was revealed when the advertisement finally came. Some had olive oil. Others discovered too late that the appearance of preparation didn't replace what should exist on the inside. The image is simple. It's deeply uncomfortable. It is possible to know the language of faith, attend religious settings, and repeat that Christ will return without cultivating real communion with Him. It's possible to talk about prophecy and still be unprepared. Biblical vigilance is not constant agitation. It is a life that remains oriented toward God, even in ordinary days. Enoch became a symbol of this attitude because Genesis summarizes his story in a few words. He walked with God. The text doesn't say that he spent each day trying to figure out when the trial would come, nor does it claim that he understood all the mysteries to come. He says he walked with God. Before Enoch's generation faced the flood, their lives had already been shaped by divine presence. Their preparation didn't begin when the first waters fell. It was built up over the years, in decisions that probably seemed small. A prayer when no one was watching. Obedience when the culture was moving in a different direction. Faithfulness when sin had become normal. This is one of the most important messages for any generation that believes it is living through decisive times. No one develops spiritual intimacy at the last second. It is built in silence, in routine, and in the repetition of choices that seem invisible but shape character. People learn to listen before a crisis arises. Learn to trust before you lose. Learn to obey before the pressure becomes unbearable. When Jesus described the days before his coming, he compared that period to the days of Noah. People ate, drank, married, and continued their activities until the flood arrived. The problem wasn't with the meals or the weddings. I was indifferent. Life went on as if God had not spoken. This is perhaps one of the most dangerous forms of spiritual slumber. It is not the aggressive rejection of faith, but a routine so full that there is no longer room to perceive what is happening within the soul. The enemy doesn't always have to destroy someone's faith. Sometimes, simply keeping it superficial is enough. Simply turn prayer into a quick obligation, Bible reading into an isolated sentence, fellowship into a social habit, conscience into an ever quieter voice. The person still believes, but he hardly listens. She still sings, but avoids silence. He still talks about God, but she makes all the decisions as if she were alone. This state can continue unnoticed for a long time until a crisis reveals what truly sustained that life. Zechariah describes Jerusalem reaching the limit of its strength. It is at this point that divine intervention becomes unmistakable. But it's not necessary to wait for a final war to recognize one's own fragility. There are silent sieges happening right now. Families consumed by resentment, people imprisoned by hidden addictions, hearts dominated by guilt, relationships maintained only for appearances, faith stifled by fear of the future. In many cases, the biggest warning sign is neither in the sky nor at the borders. It's not indoors. Therefore, preparation for the day of the Lord does not begin with identifying a coalition of countries. It begins with regret. Repentance doesn't mean living in terror, trying to earn God's forgiveness. It means recognizing the wrong path and turning to the one who offers grace. Zechariah did not only announce judgment, he spoke of a spirit of grace and supplication. Before recognition comes the action of God. Before tears comes the grace that makes it possible to see. The people look to the one who was pierced because their eyes have been opened to a truth that had been before them. This principle remains. No one awakens spiritually through sheer willpower alone. It is God who calls, confronts, and offers a response. But grace does not eliminate the human response. She makes it possible. The heart can harden or surrender. It can continue to postpone or admit that something needs to change. It can transform the warning into just another piece of content, consumed, or allow it to lead to concrete choices. Perhaps the necessary change is not to abandon a city or flee to the mountains. Perhaps it's asking for forgiveness, to break with a sin kept secret, return to praying without haste, to return what was taken, looking for someone who is injured, to renounce a practice that has slowly become a master. Prophecy becomes dangerous when it remains only in the imagination. It fulfills its purpose when it transforms the way of life. Paul wrote to the Thessalonians about the day of the Lord, but his conclusion was not an invitation to speculation. He spoke of sobriety, faith, love, and hope. Simple elements, yet difficult to fake. Faith to trust when there is no control. Love, so that fear does not destroy compassion. Hope to look beyond the chaos without denying reality. These are signs of someone who is awake. Don't panic. Not the arrogance of those who believe they have all the answers. Not the pleasure of imagining how others will judge you. True vigilance makes a person more humble, more aware of grace, and more committed to good. She's not just asking, when will all this happen? Question, how should I live while there is still time? This question shifts the focus from spectacle to responsibility. There are still people who need to be loved, wounds that need to be healed, truths that need to be told with courage, injustices that cannot be ignored, a message of reconciliation that needs to be proclaimed. Christ's return is no excuse to abandon the world. This is a reason to serve urgently. But there is a final tension in Zechariah that still needs to be understood. The chapter describing judgment ends with worship. The surviving nations rise to acknowledge the king. What began with siege ends with rule. The place scarred by war becomes a center of worship. This change reveals the true purpose of the prophecy. God doesn't intervene only to end a battle. He intervenes to establish a kingdom. And when that kingdom is revealed, there will be no doubt about who has the final say. But before talking about the peace that will come, we need to face the consequences of the confrontation, because not everyone who goes through that day will respond in the same way. Some will recognize the king. Others will still resist, even after witnessing the end of the systems in which they placed their trust. And this resistance reveals something frightening about the human heart. Not even the most compelling evidence can force surrender in those who have chosen not to submit. The human heart is capable of asking for signs, and yet rejecting what those signs reveal. This is one of the most difficult truths in Scripture. Throughout biblical history, miracles did not always produce obedience. Pharaoh saw Egypt repeatedly struck, and yet remained hardened in his heart. Israel crossed the sea, received food in the desert, and yet turned against God. Many saw Jesus' signs, heard his words, and remained resistant. The problem was never just a lack of evidence. Often, it was a lack of surrender. Zechariah concludes his vision by showing that, even after the day of the Lord, there will still be a need for submission. The surviving nations will go up to worship the King and celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. Those who refuse to go up will face the absence of rain. This means that the kingdom announced by the prophet will not be an abstract idea. There will be a government. There will be order. There will be consequences. The same Christ who was rejected, humiliated, and pierced will be recognized as king over all the earth. His rule will not depend on the approval of nations, elections, alliances, or military forces. Your authority will not be negotiated. Zechariah sums up this future with an absolute statement. The Lord will be king over all the earth. On that day, there will be one Lord and one name. All false sovereignties will fall. Empires that thought themselves eternal will have vanished. Systems that demanded absolute loyalty will have been exposed. Political, economic, and spiritual idols will lose their power to seduce. Not because humanity will finally have found a solution for itself, but because the true king will be present. This is the great reversal of chapter 14. The story begins with Jerusalem under siege. It ends with the nations climbing up to her. It begins with houses being looted and people fleeing. It ends with worship. It begins with the Mount of Olives opening up under the weight of divine intervention. It ends with holiness reaching even the most mundane details of life. Zechariah states that on that day, even the objects used in daily activities would bear the inscription, "Holiness to the Lord." What was previously restricted to temple utensils would now reach the entire city. There would be no separation between the sacred and the common. The presence of God would touch work, meals, journeys, and the simplest objects. This image reveals something profound about the ultimate purpose of the kingdom. God doesn't just want to conquer territories. He wants to restore everything. Sin fragmented creation. It separated humanity from God, divided people, contaminated relationships, and transformed power into an instrument of oppression. Since then, history has been marked by human attempts to rebuild the world without returning to the Creator. Every empire promised order. Each generation believed it could control the future, but the violence continued. Injustice has changed form. Pride has acquired new languages. Zechariah looks beyond this cycle. He sees the day when history will no longer be driven by the ambition of kings, but by the justice of the Lord. This future also appears in the book of Revelation. John sees Christ conquering the powers that rose up against God. He sees the saints reigning with him. He sees the final judgment, and afterwards, a new creation, where death, mourning, and pain no longer have a place. The images of Zechariah and John are not identical in every detail, and different Christian traditions arrange these events in distinct ways, but the center remains the same. God wins. Evil is judged. Christ reigns. Creation is restored. This is the hope that prevents the prophecy from ending in terror. Zechariah 14-12 describes a severe judgment. The text should not be softened to the point of losing its meaning. God's justice is not an empty metaphor. Wickedness will have consequences, and the arrogance of the nations will not continue indefinitely. But the judgment is not the final word. The last word is kingdom. It's not destruction. It's restoration. It is not the silence of God. It is His presence filling the earth. Therefore, prophecies were not given to provide pleasure in the downfall of others. Those who truly understand the holiness of God do not celebrate human suffering lightly. Trem. Examine your own life. And he acknowledges that no one remains standing by their own righteousness. The same Bible that announces judgment also reveals the path to reconciliation. The one who will return as king is the same one who first came as a servant. The same one who will be seen in glory allowed his hands to be wounded. The same one before whom armies will fall wept over Jerusalem. On his first visit, he did not arrive riding a war horse. He arrived humbly. Zechariah had announced this. The king would come riding on a donkey, bringing salvation. Many expected someone who would defeat Rome immediately. Jesus, however, came to confront a more profound enemy, sin. On the cross, he did not look like a victorious king. He looked defeated. He was rejected, exposed, and pierced. But what seemed like failure became the center of redemption. The judgment that sin deserved was brought upon him. The resurrection declared that death did not have the final word, and the rise ushered in a waiting period, not an empty wait, a wait sustained by promise. Jesus said that he would return. The angels told the disciples that the same Jesus who had been taken up to heaven would return. John saw him coming with the clouds. Zechariah pointed to the Mount of Olives and to the moment when the Lord would be recognized. The biblical narrative moves toward this encounter, but the crucial question is not just how the prophetic events will be organized. The question is, whom will Christ find ruling the heart? Because every person already lives under some kind of landlord. Some are ruled by fear, others in favor of approval. Some people organize their entire lives around money, control, image, or the need to win. These gentlemen rarely announce their arrival. They settle in slowly. They promise security, but demand more and more. They promise freedom, but turn desires into chains. They promise identity, but leave the heart dependent on something that can disappear. The return of Christ will publicly reveal what was already true. There is only one king worthy of absolute trust. Preparing for his coming, therefore, does not mean abandoning responsibilities or living paralyzed in the face of the news. It means putting your life in order before him. It means working with integrity because he is king. Forgive because he is king. Resist sin because he is king. To serve the vulnerable because he is king. Announce hope because he is king. Christian vigilance is not an escape from reality. It's a different way of inhabiting it. Those who believe that Christ will return don't need to pretend that suffering doesn't exist. They can face it without despair because they know it won't be eternal. You can cry without losing hope. You can confront injustice without becoming like the unjust person. You can get through unstable times without giving in to panic. This confidence does not stem from a perfect theory about the end times. It is born from the person of Christ. Perhaps no generation can say for sure that it will witness all the events described by Zechariah. Many people throughout the centuries have believed they were living through the final moments of history. Some were incorrect regarding dates and identifications, but no generation has been wrong to live prepared. For every human being, the encounter with God is always closer than it seems. Even if the day of the Lord does not happen during our lifetime, our days remain limited. This truth should not produce despair. It should produce clarity. time is too precious to be wasted on superficial faith, too precious to harbor sins that slowly destroy the soul, too precious to postpone necessary reconciliations, too precious to know everything about prophecy and almost nothing about communion with God. Enoch walked with God in a corrupt generation. Zechariah prophesied to a disheartened people amidst ruins. John received his visions while living in isolation during a period of pressure against the church. None of them spoke from easy circumstances. Still, they all pointed to the same reality. Chaos does not govern history. God rules. Empires make noise. Wars dominate headlines. The powerful seem to decide the fate of nations. But above them, there is a throne that has never been empty. The king has not yet finished the story. There's still humor in it. There is still time to return. There are still doors open for those who recognize their own need. But grace is not permission to sleep. It's a wake-up call. Zechariah did not write to satisfy curiosity about the destruction of enemies. He wrote to remind us that justice will come and that the kingdom belongs to the Lord. The unsettling verse remains before us. The meat that was consumed, the eyes were undone, the silenced language. It's an image of the ultimate limit of human arrogance. But after that, another image remains. The Lord, reigning over all the earth, the nations recognizing the King, Jerusalem restored, holiness reaching everyday life. This is the direction in which history is heading. Not for the triumph of violence, not for the eternal dominion of fear, not for the victory of some human empire. History is moving towards Christ, and when He comes, everything that seems confusing today will be brought into His light. The masks will fall. Loyalties will be revealed. The justice that many considered slow will prove perfect. Then no one will ask who was really in charge of events. Everyone will know. The pierced king will be the king recognized. The Lamb will be seen as Lord, and He who came in humility will return in glory. Until that day, the question remains open before every heart. Not only that, when will He come? But how will He find us? Distracted or vigilant? Hardened or repentant? Consumed by fear or grounded in hope? Knowing the prophecies or truly knowing the God who revealed them? Zechariah witnessed the judgment. John witnessed the victory. Enoch became remembered for walking with God. And we are given the responsibility of living between promise and fulfillment. The day of the Lord will come. But for those who belong to Christ, His arrival will not only be the end of a world marked by pain. This will be the beginning of what the human heart has always sought, but has never been able to build on its own. A kingdom without corruption, a justice system without flaws, a peace that does not depend on threats, a presence that cannot be lost. Until then, walk with God, not just when the sky looks threatening, not just when the news causes fear. Walk with Him on ordinary days, when no one is watching, and when loyalty seems too small to make a difference, because it is during ordinary days that the soul prepares itself for decisive moments. The mountain may open up, nations may rise up, the systems of this world could collapse, but those who know the King will know that the outcome was never in doubt. The Lord will be King over all the earth, and on that day there will be only one Lord and only one name.